He humiliated the 7 daughters of the slave quarters, and in the end he lost the only things he ever loved. That sentence hangs like a bruise over a house that once rang with laughter and the clink of coins. In 1833, the manor stood half-emptied, its walls sagging under neglect. The Baron, Teodoro de Alencar, sat at a window he rarely crossed and watched the land he had built with other people's labor slide away like sand through a clenched fist. People in the town would later call it misfortune, bad harvests, the kind of anonymous calamity that pretends to be natural. The women who had lived it, the ones who remembered Lucia's braided hair and the warmth of her hands, called it justice of a slow, deliberate sort. To understand how that slow justice took shape, you must travel back 13 years, to a dry season and a harvest that failed at the wrong moment. It was 1820 when the first rumor spread across the plantation like a chill wind. The coffee trees drooped, their glossy leaves curling at the edges. The berries, when crushed between thumb and forefinger, yielded a bitter, hollow taste. The Baron paced his house as if pacing could change the weather. The overseers scratched their heads, and the men in the fields turned away from one another. In the Senzala, people murmured that the soil was cursed, and when crops fail in a world built on appearances, someone must be blamed. Lucia was the obvious target. She was the healer of the quarters, a woman whose hands had set bruises and fevers to rights, who knew which leaf brewed sleep and which root eased a cough. She carried the stories of her people in her hands and the smell of camphor in her hair. For the white world that watched only to punish, that knowledge was a fault line. Teodoro, proud and insecure in the same breath, needed a cause to blame. Accusation was easier than admitting ignorance, spectacle easier than confusion. They dragged her from the small house where she kept dried herbs in a cracked earthen jar, and made her stand before the staff and the overseers, before the family and the harvest hands who had once sat by her hearth. In the yard, they taunted her with the language of fear. Witch, charlatan, pest. They demanded restitution. The Baron wanted humiliation that would serve as a lesson. He wanted fear to spread faster than any wind. He had her stripped of dignity and led to the auction of names and bodies, the marketplace for men and women where the world he controlled and the world he feared met in a single bitter transaction. Before the cart took Lucia away toward the mines, places of iron and heat where so many were sent never to return whole, she pressed a small thing into the hands of her eldest daughter. It was a leather pouch, soft from years of being carried close to skin, frayed at the seams and smelling faintly of rue and tamarind. Dahlia turned it over with fingers that trembled. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, were a scrap of bone and a folded thread tied in 3 tight knots. Lucia's voice was low, the kind that refuses to be broken by the noisy cruelty around it. She told Dahlia to keep it always, to hide it beneath her shift when the sun was high, and to remember the names of those who had taught her how to mend a wound. "Survive," she said. "Remember." Then the cart creaked away. Some of the children in the Senzala would not see Lucia again. The Baron sought applause from his household. His wife, Donna Estella, kept her face set to the social line, sharp glances given and returned with the calculation of a woman who knew the world of salons and marriages. Teodoro Filio, the son, kept his distance as if distance could preserve him from the stain. But the sight of Lucia hauled away made something else gather in the dark, the knowing eyes of 7 daughters who had learned how to listen to pain. They swore an oath that night. It was not a fevered vow taken at the height of revenge. They were not children of impulse. Seated on the packed earth of their sleeping room, beneath the shadow of a roof that had heard generations of the same, they made a different kind of promise. Dahlia held the leather pouch in her lap, and the other 6 girls, Bina, Mara, Zephyr, Ina, Iara, Kira, placed their hands upon it in the low light. The words were simple and cold with purpose. The Baron would not be given death handed by them. He would be permitted to live and to watch the steady undressing of what he valued most. He would be stripped of honor and fortune until his house and name meant nothing. They would not become tyrants. They would unmake his tyranny by the slow, patient unthreading of its seams. That was the oath, a vow of patience, of intelligence, of endurance. The first nights afterward were thick with planning that would sound impossible to those who imagine resistance as spectacle. There was no grand conspirator on horseback, No stranger from the sea armed with letters of emancipation. There was a sewing needle, a ledger, a scrap of charcoal. Knowledge smuggled in hushed tones and traded for food. There was no sudden fire. There was practice. Dahlia vowed to read. She had been allowed to stand in the shadow of a traveling bookbinder once, to run her fingers along a prayer book left to whiten on a table. Those letters, dark and secret, became a portal. She learned to trace sums and columns once she had hidden a scrap of paper and copied the overseer's accounts by night. She read the ledgers the way other women read runes. She learned what an extra coin meant when a seed failed to be planted, and who profited when shipments arrived late. Numbers, she understood, were a language of power. Find the errors, and you learn where the house kept its worth. Bina went into the Casa Grande as a child choosing silence. Sturdy, small with a patient face, she became a servant in the kitchen, and then, through years of careful constancy, won the trust to clear plates, refill cups, fold the linen that hung in Donna Estella's private room. Her ears discovered the cadence of secrets, the way the Baron clipped his anger into polite phrases, the tremor in Donna Estella's voice when she spoke of debts, the hesitations that betrayed a man's fear of losing standing. Bina learned to move unseen where conversations happened, behind doors, under stairways, in the corridor where the Baron closed the ledger and pretended not to look at the ledger's margins. Mara cultivated an intimacy that was a weapon. Not beautiful in the way salons define beauty, though she possessed an arresting calm, but she knew the small courtesies that encouraged confidences. She was given the task of becoming someone the family could talk to without fearing consequence. Letters passed through her hands. Men confided and let down their guard in rooms where a woman's presence was a perfunctory comfort. She learned which signatures carried authority and which were mere flattery. With a careful hand she became a carrier of things. Notes tucked in seams, whispers turned into drafts that looked as though they had always belonged to the household. Zifa worked among the drying yards, where coffee beans spread like a sunlit carpet, and men bent like grasses. Her touch was nimble. She had worked all her life with grain and pods and the slow alchemy of fermentation. If a taste could be altered, she knew which hand might change it. Her work was not dramatic. She learned to dust a bean with a fungus powder that would rot the flavor weeks later, not immediately, indistinguishable from the ordinary deceit of weather. Her sabotage had to be subtle enough to be dismissed as chance, recurring enough to cause a pattern. Complaints from buyers, shipments returned, the Baron charging men and overseers for an invisible fault. Aina taught herself the language of leaves. She learned to grind and make poultices that soothed, and potions that settled a fever. But she also learned the faint art of dosing, how to make a man restless without striking him down, how to loosen sleep from a house and place him at a window in the small hours, rubbing his temples, sewing the image of failing memory into worry. Her knowledge was not of poison that killed, it was of precision. A touch here, a tincture there, and the Baron's confidence would not die overnight but would be chipped like old mortar, until a second here and another there made ruin inevitable. Chiara became a shadow in town. Her small frame fit into alleys where merchants shouted their lists and where letters gathered like leaves. She listened to market talk. She memorized patterns of trade that reached beyond the plantation, routes, ships, names of buyers who mattered. She learned which rumor traveled fastest, which name could be used once and never again, which seed of doubt would spread. She became, in effect, a post of information, a sieve that sifted gossip into strategy. Kira's work was in the washhouse. The laundry room was a world of wet linens where pockets turned up like secrets. Men left letters in clothing without thinking. Notes slipped out of sleeves and into the suds. Kira learned to read patterns in the way laundry arrived, whose shirt bore the scorch of a fire from a distant tavern, which collar carried the linen stamped from the capital. She found receipts tucked inside towels, slips that proved a shipment had been made weeks late. To her eye, fabric told truth. They trained in silence and with laughter that tasted of iron. They measured the years by knots in a length of cord they kept hidden beneath the floor. Each knot marked a season, a learning, a small victory. They were not all young. They grew older in ways that mattered. Dahlia's hands gained the steadiness of a woman who had spent hours copying columns. Bina's face learned to conceal any quickening of emotion. Mara became familiar with the sign of a man about to betray himself. Zephyr's fingers learned to measure powder by feel. Ina learned the slow economy of a dose. Yara grew swift. Kira, patient. Their meetings were ritualized to avoid suspicion. They met beneath a mango tree, behind a low hum of the herd, under the pretense of mending a net. They spoke in fragments, in the code of women who share kin and imprisonment. The river is low. The cassava burns early, a way of saying more than the plain words aloud. They were careful, even in their tenderness. Few outside the quarters could read their faces. The Baron, accustomed to using commands, never learned their grammar. There were costs. Loyalty among them required small betrayals to outsiders, a lie to an overseer, a withheld kiss to a man who wanted more than their company. They learned to sleep with one eye open, to accept small cruelties from the world that had already taken Lucia from them. Sometimes a neighbor in the quarters would be punished for a rumor, and they would tremble at the price. At night, the planning had edges of sorrow. They spoke of the inability to sit and watch a child grow without thinking of the mother missing from the hearth. Occasionally, Dahlia held the leather pouch and thought of Lucia's voice, and sometimes that memory punctured the resolution behind her eyes with fresh pain. Slowly, deliberately, they made their first moves. Not all sabotage was spectacular. The first triumphs were measured in return notes, in merchant complaints, in a small loss in the ledger that Dahlia discovered and capitalized upon. A buyer in Bahia who once praised the Baron's bean found bitterness in a shipment and sent a note of complaint. The inspector's letter travelled back with an irritated tone, but no accusation of malevolence. Zephyr had dusted a small batch with a powder that turned the drying process awry. It passed through hands and time until a merchant, tasting a roasted sample, frowned and sent the cargo back. It was a small thing, a crate, a ship delayed, but it was the beginning of a pattern. At home the Baron felt it like an itch he could not scratch. He blamed the land, the weather, the inattention of men who had grown careless. He called the overseer to his office in the Casa Grande and demanded reasons. The overseer promised to find them, demanded more hands, more whipping, and more oversight. Teodoro's anger became a chain of orders and reproaches. Donna Estela frowned at the letters before him and asked questions about the family's standing in the capital. The Baron responded with sharper measures, making public displays of authority that were thin as paper in the face of a slow, invisible undermining. Bina took to leaving small traces, a cup slightly ajar where a letter could be dropped unnoticed, a scrap of the ledger folded into a cook's apron. She learned to make errors look like carelessness. When the Baron accused someone at a meeting of being forgetful, it fed his paranoia. A house built on managed appearances needs an audience to believe the show. When that audience begins to doubt, the stage begins to creak. Mara, carrying words in and out of rooms, sowed small seeds of gossip that arrived like a fly buzzing in the Baron's ear. She let slip a phrase about merchants whispering of debts in the capital. She let a misplaced note reveal a name that could be tied to an opponent. The aristocratic world outside the property thrived on alliances. Rumor was its currency. Once the coin of reputation was muddied, alliances frayed. Ina's work produced restless nights for the Baron. A tincture applied subtly to the tea served on some long morning would make his hand tremble when he signed his name, or wake him in the small hours wiping sweat. No one could point to her. Such symptoms were commonplace among men in any household. They were merely human faults. But when a pattern of sleeplessness met a pattern of shipments returned, and a ledger short of an amount that had been there the month before, even a Baron begins to suspect the world is conspiring against him. Dahlia began to keep a copy of every account she could access. She learned where the Baron's money moved like currents under a riverbed, payments for repair that could have been merely covered by a shipment that never arrived, or a ledger entry marking machinery that carried an inflated cost. Once she found a duplicate charge for a cart repair and another entry that suggested a payment to a name that had long been dead. She did not shout this discovery. She tucked it into her memory and let it do its work. Numbers bent under scrutiny and revealed the hands that had been greedy. She passed notes to Mara with tinted ink, letting them travel like ordinary orders. Kira found receipts in the lining of shirts worn on market days. Yara, crossing town, listened to the whispers of merchants, and fed the names back to the sisters. The web widened, not by violence, but by the slow unspooling of facts. They were meticulous. If a letter was to be forged, and some had to be, they made sure the hand looked right. The paper smelled like other paper in the house. They did not leave immediate trails. Their actions were the economy of delay. A repaired loom that broke weeks later because a cog had been loosened, a plantation tool misaligned just enough to slow a harvest, a ledger entry lost to a mouse that left a missing sum. Alongside their sabotage, they cultivated allies where alliances could be made without exposing themselves. A young stable hand who had once been kind to Kira found his wages delayed. Mara slipped a rumor to him that the Baron was withholding pay for cash flow issues. That stable hand grew resentful and soon found his loyalty unmoored. A merchant in the town, used to playing both sides, began to speak to the overseer of possible insolvency for the estate. Small, believable signs multiplied into a more dangerous impression outside the walls. And the Baron, who understood only demonstrations of control, responded in kind. He tightened his household, sent men to the capital to plead for favors, scolded his wife for any social misstep. If the house began to notice cracks, his instinct was to hammer them shut. What the Baron could not bear was the whisper in the drawing rooms, the idea that his name might be less than it used to be. Reputation, in his world, moved faster than money. Once reputation cracks, money follows. Through it all, the sisters kept a careful tally of costs. Each small success demanded a sacrifice. Sometimes it meant staging an argument in the kitchen to create an alibi, or sending a child away for a day and returning him with a new bruise. It meant Dahlia spending nights hunched by a scrap of candlelight copying accounts until her eyes wept. It meant Ina dosing a cup so slightly that the taste was not noticed in the moment, but that loosened sleep that carried the Baron into days of distraction. It meant Zephyr, with the smell of coffee on her hands, watching buyers turn away. Each of these were acts of resistance, but they left marks not only on the Baron's pride, but on the sisters themselves. Exhaustion, guilt, the knowledge that the path they had chosen traded one kind of suffering for another. And yet the plan worked its small miracles. In one season, a shipment expected to bring good news returned with notes of complaint. A creditor in Salvador sent a curt letter. A friend of the family raised a delicate question at a dinner party. The Baron, who had once commanded deference, found himself answering for the failings that he could not control. It is one thing to be reminded of mortality, quite another to be shown that fewer people believe in you. As the years accrued, so did their confidence. The cord under the floor had more knots. Dahlia had learned to predict the way a man bent in the presence of a ledger. Bina could tell by the way a cup was held whether a name was spoken honestly. Mara could intercept a letter with the gentleness of a lover. Zephyr could make spoilage look like weather. They moved like a quiet hand on the face of the Baron's world, pressing the wrong buttons in the right order. Teodoro, the son, matured into a reckless man ill-suited to the nuance of his father's anxieties. He had a temper and a jealous streak. He preferred duels to diplomacy and horses to ledgers. The sisters observed him, building dossiers of misdeeds and softening him where necessary by the careful arrangement of exposure and embarrassment. He was a brittle instrument, enough friction, and he would break in a way that cost his father dearly. In 1832, 13 years since Lucia's removal, a pattern had emerged beyond private worry. The Baron's friends in the capital, men with votes and titles and an appetite for stories that fed them, began to receive the same hints that had unsettled the manor. Rumors of a man overly concerned with his accounts, a household strained by inspections, a young heir who had angered an ally. Such talk moved like a shadow at halls of power. The sisters did not telegraph their presence. They let the world construct its own narrative, and the world in its hunger for gossip did the rest. Yet every success carried its own risk. When a crate was returned with an official notation of complaint, the overseer's suspicion nearly curled into violence. A hired hand noticed Zephyr's frequent presence near the drying barns and mentioned it to the overseer. Zephyr avoided the lash by a hair, escaping a confrontation by the grace of a late rain that distracted men from the jobs they thought urgent. Each close call tightened the cord of their plans and reminded the sisters of the price of misstep. They were learning to move like surgeons in a house that preferred swords. The one thing they could not account for was the human unpredictability outside their control. A political slight in the capital, a friendship soured by an insult. A cavalier word from the sun could change an alignment between men who were as capable of exacting revenge as they were of granting clemency. Still, the sisters worked with what they had: patience, knowledge, and each other. So when a letter with a name across its top arrived in Dahlia's hands in late winter of 1832, a small, unassuming paper that read like a private invitation, she allowed herself a brief flicker of anticipation. Nothing for her, she reminded herself. Not yet. But that very season would prove the pivot that no one could predict. The Baron's illusion of control grew thinner. He began to misplace small things: a signet ring, a note. He began to make decisions in the night that he would later regret. He cut teeth into the ledger without understanding where those cuts had been made. The sisters watched as the man who had once humiliated their mother grew anxious in the way of men who feel invisible crowds closing around them. On a night when the rain smelled of iron and the sky hung low, they gathered as they had gathered for 13 years, under the mango, with a kettle on the coals and the leather pouch between them. Dahlia opened the scrap of cloth and smoothed the 3 knots with a finger. The patois did not do magic. It was a memory of a mother, a compass for decision, a token that held stories. They did not cross themselves or call for omens. They placed the pouch in the center and touched it, because making the pact visible mattered as much as keeping it secret. They spoke not of triumph, but of the next sequence. The names of men had been written down. The ledger errors had been catalogued. A plan was being sown to bind one public humiliation to another, not with flames first, but with the shredding of alliances, the exposure of debts, the slow collapse of prestige. They had learned that people who lived by reputation were tender to slights. They would use that tenderness. The Baron slept badly that month. He prowled the house and slammed doors he had never slammed. He accused overseers of treason in the privacy of his office and blamed his son for a lack of steel in the house. Teodoro Filho strode like a man who would sooner strike than think, who had been raised to react rather than to reckon. He would become the instrument of his father's ruin if the sisters played their cards well. At the edge of the courtyard, in the wash where Kira bent over tubs steaming with soap, a different sort of counting took place. She folded shirts and felt in seams the impressions of letters, the tiny folds that betrayed a signature. She tucked away a small receipt that proved a late shipment and passed it to Dahlia in a stitch of linen. Yara came in from the market with the clipped cadence of a woman who had listened to an argument between 2 merchants. In one voice, she heard the name of a ship that had not been paid. The pieces began to fit together like a puzzle that had been waiting for hands. By spring of 1833, their cautious maneuvers had borne a visible tremor in the Baron's life. A friend in the capital suggested a duel might mend a wounded pride. A letter arrived in the manor, its script neat and cold, suggesting mediation. The Baron's response was private and sharp. He would not be mediated. It was precisely at this point, when the house was on edge and the Baron's reactions were the clumsy flails of a man losing his stage, that the sisters moved from the economy of delay to the economy of exposure. They did not rush. They had promised themselves 13 years of patience for this very reason, to ensure that when the strike came, it would be impossible to treat as coincidence. They would not burn houses in fits of rage. They would dismantle the house's authority like a craftsman, unpicking a seam, 1 stitch at a time, so that when it finally gave way, the fall would be total and undeniable. The work began with a letter. It was a small thing, a folded note that looked like the ordinary correspondence of a gentleman, but Mara had made a careful alteration. She altered a single line to suggest an intimacy between Teodoro Filho and a woman in the capital. She made the signature look as though it had been added in haste. The forged note was meant to be scandalous enough to whip the rumor mills, but not so brazen as to be dismissed out of hand. It landed as planned. On a plain morning, a servant found it in a coat pocket, and following the circuit of men who loved to read other people's affairs, it found its way to the wrong eyes. The seed, once planted, began to sprout. Good men gossip and jealous men die for the smallest slights. Over the next weeks, The note would travel to Cloves Medeiros, a politician with more pride than sense, whose honor could be salved only by blade. The sword, old-fashioned and stupid, would be called upon to settle what could have been settled with conversation. A duel would be arranged, old rules, strict codes, a performance in which men measure one another in public to repair a wound created by private desire. And yet the sisters knew that a duel would be a spectacle the Baron could not bear if it ended badly for his son. If the heir wore shame, if his body was marred, the alliances that sheltered the manor could dissipate like fog. The plan, therefore, did not rely on death. It relied on injury and humiliation. It relied on the slow corrosion of pride. They sat in their places and watched the house respond, watching for the unguarded moment when a man who had been the center of a small empire would begin to misread the world. They did not celebrate. They polished the edges of their plan like a blade, sharpened not for blood but for unraveling. In the days that followed, the Baron's temper turned inward. He woke early and reviewed ledgers with a tight face. He saw shadows in his halls. Donna Estella, once a woman of social refinement, began to practice a small brittle smile that did not reach her eyes. She had been taught to preserve appearances. Now she became an accomplice to them, pinning false confidence to her dress like a brooch. Teodoro Filho, proud and hot, trained in secret, his fist finding swift targets at the practice field, while his father fretted over the letters returned to the manor. The stage was set for a confrontation that was, in its way, inevitable. The sisters watched the house from their safe places. Bina, bearing silver platters into a dining room where a man changed color. Kira, folding shirts now smelling faintly of someone else's perfume. Mara delivering a message that looked ordinary but carried the wrong line. Zephyr watching ships leave the port with an eye that knew which crate might be missing. Ina brewed a calming tea for a boy who would need steadiness. They were not reckless. They had no desire to kill. They wished only to make a man who had bargained in human lives understand what it means to be stripped of currency in a world that prized it more than life. There were nights when Dahlia sat alone by the cupboard and opened the leather pouch. She would press her thumb against the knots and imagine Lucia's hands closing over hers. Sometimes the memory hurt so sharply she could not breathe. Other days it gave her the edge she needed to order her next move. The cord under the floor had more knots now. They had been counting for 13 years, and each knot was a story of sacrifice and survival and patience. One evening, as the house settled into a lull that felt like a sleep before a storm, Dahlia wrote a single line by candlelight and sealed it with wax she found under the table. The line was small and had been rehearsed in her mind until it tasted like truth. She folded it and tucked it into Mara's apron with the casualness of a woman passing bread. No pageant, no last-minute flourish, just the quiet placement of a seed. They had no weapons, no allies in high places, only a promise, a patuar, and terrible patience. They were about to test whether that was enough. They had no weapons, no allies in high places, only a promise, a patuar, and terrible patience. They were about to test whether that was enough. Mara folded the little sealed line into the larger packet she carried as though it were an ordinary errand. Outside, a moonless wind moved through the sugar grass and made the mangoes clap softly as if the trees themselves were gossiping. She crossed the service yard with the easy step of a woman who belongs where she moves. A servant relieved her for a moment at the gate, and Mara slipped into the lane that led toward the town. At the corner she met a man who could be bought with a look and a story. He took the letter without question, tucked it into the lining of his coat, and moved like a man transporting nothing but routine papers. It would be at Cloves Medeiros' hands within 3 days. The sisters had counted on the hunger in the grate for evidence of scandal. It would be offered to them without the need to wield a blade. When the letter reached Medeiros, he read it as men of his class read affronts, quickly, with the bright flare of injury. He had a code as old as his money. Slights demanded correction. He took his offense to the forum of a duel, and that was the instrument the sisters needed. The duel would be public. Reputations would be measured not by ledgers now, but by blood and posture. If a son bled in public, if his hand failed him, the Baron's pillar would crack. Teodoro Filho met the challenge as the kind of man who believes he can exact order with a blade. He was young, hot, brittle at the core. He rode to the appointed place with a swagger that disguised deeper unease. His father, who could not abide the suggestion of humiliation, pushed him into the role of honor's defender, into the pageant of knives and etiquette. On the day men gathered to watch, the air held a strange, anticipatory hush, the sound of a community expecting a spectacle that would confirm a notion of strength. What happened at dawn was neither heroic nor spectacular. It was private enough to ruin the public face of a household. Steel flashed. Two men moved with the ritual of old codes. There was no noble death. Teodoro received a wound to his arm, an inch graze that would not kill, but that would mark him in a manner worse than loss of blood. It would weaken the hand that should have steadied a coat of arms, and it would stain him in the eyes of his peers. In the weeks that followed, he wore a limp and a bandage and the look of a man who had been found less than whole. His temper deepened into something desperate. He drank more. He rode faster. He began to squander alliances by fits of jealous violence, by insult and bad choice. Invitations stopped arriving to the tables where fortunes were stitched. Creditors in distant cities, once deferential, began to murmur about risk when invited to invest. The sisters watched as they always had from the shadow lines. The duel had not been bloodless. No one besides the wounded man's pride was meant to die, but it had achieved what they designed. It made the home waver. Friends who had once come to dinners with polite laughter now hesitated to lend their names or their credit. Men who had been content to escort Donna Estela to salons began to distance themselves. Reputation, brittle as spun glass, shed small slivers, and then clarified itself as loss. Dahlia kept the ledger entries in her head like prayers. She could trace the path of favors and payments the way a cartographer tracks riverbeds. With the sun impaired, the Baron turned more and more to displays of authority that read as panic rather than command. He enlarged punishments for small faults and tried to make the house's order into a thing of spectacle, but spectacle without faith is theatre without an audience. People outside the walls began to speak differently of the manor. Where once polite rumor shielded its excesses, now curiosity cut through the velvet. The sisters stepped forward again, not with flame but with a sequence of small exposures meant to avalanche into ruin. It was Mara who found the moment to deliver the critical nudge. A merchant in the capital who had once extended credit to the Baron received, by happenstance, a note misplaced in a bundle of bills. An error made, apparently, by the Baron's private clerk. The note suggested that a payment due from the Baron had been redirected to a name that did not belong to any living business. The merchant sent his question up the line. The question became an inquiry. The inquiry became a whispered conversation over brandy in a room that valued appearances as a currency. In such rooms, suspicion is contagious and cures are slow. When the first official letters asking for clarification arrived at the Casa Grande, Donna Estela fluttered like a moth near a lamp, attempting to preserve the glow of their house. She answered with precise politeness. She summoned the overseer and demanded explanations. She sent word to friends in the capital with honeyed lines and half-truths, but the honey could not cover every crack. Men asked questions now. Ledger entries were read aloud. A man with a ledger is as dangerous as a man with a cannon when he learns to name fault. The web the sisters had spun now began to be seen as pattern by those who esteemed predictability. Where once a bad shipment was a misfortune, now it was a sequence of failures, a thread of lost bills, a missing carriage that could no longer be explained away. The Baron's requests for loans were met with offers couched in caution. He found himself in need of money for repairs, for newly urgent debts. The moneymen, who had long enjoyed the Baron's largesse as an investment, began to calculate risk. They tightened terms. They withdrew the cushions of credit that had once softened his missteps. Still, paper and rumor do not fell a house alone. They make it stumble. To fell it entirely required a final, undeniable act, a spectacle that showed the world the fragility at its center. For the sisters, that act would be symbolic and material at once. They did not rush to violence. They wrought a ruin that mirrored the one the Baron had inflicted upon their lives, a burning that would take what remained of his public face, the storerooms, the drying barns, the trays of coffee that represented his trade, and leave ash where currency had once gleamed. They prepared for fire as they had prepared for everything else, with patient knowledge. Zephyr knew the barns, their joints, the slow places where heat would hide. She knew the stores of dry straw, the cracked thresholds where a spark could set whole shelves alight. The sisters worked in shifts, moving straw and loosening beams here and there in subtle ways that would not be noticed until night. They took care to avoid loss of life. Their plan forbade the kind of cruelty that kills indiscriminately. They chose a night when the harvest hands would be in the town for a festival, when the stable boys were at the tavern, when the overseer was on a run to the capital pleading with creditors. They aimed for property, for the symbol of his wealth. They aimed not to make martyrs, but to remove the means by which he would continue to pray. When the hour came, they moved like a single quiet body. Lanterns shadowed faces that showed no joy. Hands worked with mechanics refined by years of practice. A small ember, careful as a whispered word, found dry shavings, and then climbed. Fire is a slow, greedy thing. It eats through the patterns men trust. Smoke rose in a column from the main drying barn, and across the plain it cut into the night like an accusation. The plantation woke in commotion, not with the shrieking of grief at loss of life, but with the unmistakable sound of flames eating what was left of a man's livelihood, barns collapsing, roofs sagging, heaps of beans blackening into sour ash. Men ran with pails, but the fire had reached the heart of the store. The black smoke carried the scent of roasted coffee and the bitter, acrid tang of ruin. By dawn, the main storage and several drying houses were ruined beyond quick repair. The loss was material, but its message was social. The Baron's harvest, his claim to steady profit, lay on the ground in ash. The fire did not go unnoticed in town. A farmer from the next estate watched the smoke and came running, breathless with the first rumors. The Baron, frantic, stood in the courtyard as the men with shovels and axes retreated, and for the first time in years, he saw more than the loyalty he'd once commanded. Creditors sent terse letters. The capital's brokers met and counted risk. The Baron could not conjure money from his rage. It was then that the sisters performed the most intimate humiliation, the stealing of what remained of his honor. The Baron had received, some months earlier, word that a visiting official from the capital would come to commend him for services rendered to the crown, an official ceremony with a velvet box and an embroidered sash, a thing of cold metal and warmer pride. The medal itself was a shrine of his vanity, a gilded proof that his name had worth beyond his fences. The sisters knew that if they took that medal and remade its meaning, they could convert the symbols of his status into instruments of derision. The taking required cunning. They had been practicing for years the art of being unseen in rooms where other people trusted them to be invisible. Dahlia waited until a banquet had dispersed and Donna Estella had retired to her bedchamber. She entered a small way, a servant's pass, a curtain half drawn, a key that had been pilfered and polished for such moments. Inside the velvet-lined box lay the medal, cold and bright. Dahlia's fingers closed around it for a heartbeat, and the metal bit into her palm like ownership into conscience. She thought of Lucia's hands, and then she did what the oath required. She unthreaded possession and turned it into a relic of shame. They prepared the replacement in the same breathless care with which they had prepared fires and forged notes. A straw doll was made from the remains of a broom and scraps of old linen, tied and stuffed with a small amount of ash and a scrap of paper, an offering of mockery shaped in the image of the Baron's earlier accusations of their mother. The doll had no terror in it. It was a symbol. They placed it carefully within the velvet box, arranged the ribbon about it so it sat like a ridiculous, insulted jest, and then they returned the box to its place, with hands that trembled but did not falter. The real medal had been folded into a piece of oilcloth and secreted away beneath the floorboards of the sugar house, where later, after the ash cooled, they would dig and bury it deep. The day the official arrived, the world watched. Servants lined the path, polished and instructed. Donas in borrowed finery took their places on the low steps. Men adjusted coats that had been pressed for the purpose of standing with adequate bearing. The official, a man who wore his office like a clean, starched collar, took up the velvet box with the surety of one who handles honors daily. He opened it before the assembled crowd. There, instead of cold metal that gleamed with imperial sanction, was a small, ridiculous straw figure. its threadbare limbs and the scrap of paper tucked at its heart visible for all to see. Silence fell at first, the polite hesitation of people learning whether a misstep was part of ceremony or not. Then the official laughed. It was not a vicious laugh. It was a laugh that came from a place of discomfort and confusion, a reflex to the absurd. Laughter in a room of the powerful is a social scalpel. It cuts. The Baron, crimson-lipped and suddenly small, rose as if to protest a trick, but his voice struck the circumference of his audience and fell. He had in public been offered a mockery of what he held dear. Men exchanged those looks that ask whether one should be seen with a man whose honors are now the subject of ridicule. Newspapers in the capital dispatched short, tidy paragraphs about the affair. They called it an embarrassing mistake in presentation, or a regrettable error in gifts. Gentlemen who wrote columns about commerce and industry remarked upon a calamitous harvest and the perils of weather. No journalist in the capital wrote of the Kaffir who had engineered the substitution, nor of the 7 daughters who had orchestrated ruin. Where the press could not see, where the papers wanted comfortable explanations, the truth became an invisible offense. Yet in the house and in the quarters, word traveled like smoke. An official had opened a box and found the very image of contempt. When the Baron understood that the medal in his drawer had been removed, that a mockery had been presented in its stead, and that his image had been laughed at beyond his walls, his behavior turned from panic to something more brittle. He called for inquiries. He accused servants. He ordered searches and interrogations. Men were beaten and dismissed. He demanded explanations from the capital. But the evidence he kept close, payments and ledgers and the vault of his pride, had been undermined by months of patient work. The money men tightened and the creditors fanned out like birds sensing a bad wind. Alliances that had once been held by dinners now dissolved into excuses. In the cool hours after the fire, when men counted losses and hoped for mercy, the sisters gathered among the blackened rafters of what had been a storeroom. The ash still smeared their fingers. They opened the oilcloth and lifted the cold medal between them. It had lost none of its weight. It shone dully with a promise once meant to bless, and now a relic meant to be buried. They did not look at it with triumph, as much as with a fierce, exhausted comprehension that they had taken a thing that had been used to seal their mother's fate and made it something else. They buried it where the coffee had burned most completely, in the earth of a field that had been stripped of its crop. The act was quiet and without chanting. Dahlia dug with hands made steady by years of small, steady labor. They laid the medal in the hole and covered it with ash, with soil, with the weight of the night. On top of the grave, Dahlia placed the leather patois, folded and worn and smelling still faintly of the camphor Lucia had carried. They did not bury bones, they buried memory and insult, and then they let the earth close over it as if to press history into the ground where it might not be taken lightly. The Baron's deterioration after these events was not a single dramatic collapse, but a sliding away. His friends in the capital, men who measured the usefulness of other men with fine scales, withdrew their gossip and their co-signatures. Dealers in town who had once taken his word now demanded proofs and marks. A few months after the fire and the mockery of the medal, the landlord found his lines of credit narrowed. He could not pay for new storage barns, nor for the imported machinery his overseer recommended. The repairs came with payment delays that cost him ships and then clients. The people he had thought would hold him up found it easier to let him fall. The Baron's anger edged into something that resembled grief, a bleak, stuttering hunger for the currency that had defined his life. The household's social calendar thinned. Donna Estella, bound through marriage to a name that had once opened doors, found herself invited less frequently to the salons, where fortune and marriage matched faces. She still tied ribbons in the morning and still took tea, but the gatherings where she might once have smiled with assurance now looked away. On certain afternoons, she would stand at a window and smooth a tablecloth with the mechanical motions of someone practicing their role in a play that had lost its audience. In the dusk, she would turn a silver spoon in her hand and look at it as if it might answer the question of what had happened to her station. Teodoro Filio's injury never mended fully. His arm remained weak. He favored it when he rode. The injury made him less fit to conduct the public performances of masculinity that had once given him purchase in dining rooms and on committees. Where once his father's name had been enough to seat a man at table, now men hesitated and calculated whether association carried risk. The son's temper, always his greatest asset in private skirmish, became a liability in public life. He made enemies with slights and with the bluntness of a man losing favor. In a society that prized reputation above many things, what mattered most to the Baron dissolved. As the economy of the house folded, the sisters watched what they had unmade settle into new shapes. The plantation, which had once run with the crisp order of axes and accounts, became a place of rumors and of men who took their meals abroad. The staff dwindled as wages were delayed. A few left for the port city or for other estates, where life might be no kinder, but where a man's name offered steadier returns. The Baron's wealth dwindled into obligations. For some, his ruin was simply misfortune. For others, it read like the end of a tyrant's paragraph in a book of local history. Newspapers, as they so often do, smoothed the jagged edges. Where men feared to call out the truth, editors would rather call it accident. They printed pondered editorials about the vicissitudes of agriculture and bad seasons. An even-handed article proposed that poor harvests and mismanagement had combined to undermine a once proud estate. No reporter in the capital wrote the story the Senzala had been telling for 13 years. The accounts of the servants, the women's own testimony, lived in voices around kitchen fires and wash basins, in the hush of market days and whispered at baptisms and funerals. There it was called what it was: careful reparation. The sisters did not celebrate when the Baron lost his last carriage, or when a final creditor presented a judgment. Their faces at the mango tree, the night they buried the medal, were not masks of triumph. There was a hollow where exhilaration might have been expected. They had spent 13 years becoming instruments of a very particular justice, but justice has a way of leaving hollows that only time fills. For each small victory, there had been loss of sleep, of the parts of themselves that might have been given to other things, the need to hide relationships, to lie, and to practice the art of vanishing. After the burning and the replacement of the commenda, life in the quarters continued. The sisters kept many of their practices out of sight. Ina's hands grew stiff from years of preparing tinctures. Sometimes she coughed in the night, and Dahlia would touch her shoulder as if to say it was enough. Zephyr walked past the ruined drying yards and paused to rest her palm on a scarred beam, as if the wood might speak to her of what had been done. Mara wrote little now. The artifice she had used to manipulate words had cost her certain innocence. Bina still moved in the Casa Grande with a face that could not betray what it had witnessed. Kira found in the wash a small comfort. The monotony of rubbing and rinsing was a place where memory did not demand action. Yara, who had once been the voice that moved news, became a keeper of stories, and at night, children would sit under the eaves and hear the tale of their mother Lucia and of the sisters who kept their promise. Dahlia bore the greatest weight. She had been the one to take the medal from its box and to place the patois in the earth. She had learned to read ledgers and to unpick numbers. In quiet hours, she would run a thumb over the knots of the leather pouch and think of Lucia's small hand pressing it into hers. Sometimes she would imagine Lucia's eyes, and the memory would be sharp as a blade. Often she felt as though she had traded one kind of captivity for another. The years of patient planning had bound her to a purpose that left little room for anything else. What she had wanted most, perhaps simply the right for a child to sleep with their mother, had been answered in a way she had not expected. The sisters gathered sometimes, years later, in the same circle where they had sworn the oath. They were older. They had the marks of time at their temples and in their hands. When they spoke of the past, they spoke in fragments, practical things, names of ledgers, the way a certain merchant loved sugar even when coffee was suspect. There was relief in their voices. There was also a muted sadness. They had unmade the Baron's empire, yes, but they had also become historians of their own violence, and there was an ache in that labor. What passed for public history was tidy. Journalists and the polite circles called it calamity, the result of bad crops and poor management. Men in the capital scribbled articles about the perils of relying on a single export. The idea of a woman's vengeance stitched into the fabric of the economy was not an acceptable pattern to name. But in the mouths of the people who had lived it, the story was explicit and passed on with the devotion accorded to truth. Lucia had been taken, the daughters had vowed, and they had answered with patience and cleverness. That version lived in kitchens and at markets, and in the soft places where memory survives. The Baron lived to see the house he had raised become something like a museum of neglect. He reduced his journeys, his appetite for entertainments plummeted. Sometimes a neighbor saw him at his window, like a man who had become a portrait of himself, there and not there at once. He had lost, in the slow measure the sisters intended, the things he loved most: his public standing, the obedience of his household, the net of patrons that had cushioned him. He sat with paper in hand, and found no letters that did not bring demands. He lost money, true, but even that was only a symptom. The thing that hurt him most was the knowledge that men now skirted his name. In the end, it was loneliness, more than poverty, that unstitched him. The sisters never said they had a desire to free anyone by law. They had no power to grant formal emancipation from within the manor's walls. The people who left the estate did so in the slow, uncertain movement possible in a world where legal status was not the only measure of freedom. Some slipped away to relatives in nearby towns. Others took the chance to find a job in the port. A few remained, tied by family and the inertia of life. The sisters' victory did not translate into a proclamation of liberty. It translated into the unraveling of the Baron's ability to continue as he had. That unraveling gave men and women room to breathe differently. Whether that breath became full freedom or a partial reprieve depended on circumstances beyond their control. There is a cost to this kind of justice that the sisters never denied. They had traded years of possible tenderness for a schedule of retribution. There were moments, after the fires, when Dahlia would lie awake and count the knots they had tied for themselves, as if the knots themselves suggested the cumulative pain. She would caress the patois and think of Lucia's instruction: survive, remember. They had survived. They had remembered. They had paid a price. In the soft months that followed, the plantation fell into a slow decline. Trees grew where carts had once passed. Grasses, wild and tall, reclaimed tracks. Men who had once walked the fields with authority now had to take up other trades, or else stand idle by the road and watch seasons pass. The manor itself, unable to command the same resources, became less a seat of power and more a house that kept its own ghost. People in the town told the story in fragments. "He had bad seeds that year," wrote one man. "He lost money by reckless investment," wrote another. The press offered polite analyses and left out the small hands that had reshaped history. But the Senzala knew differently. They spoke the names of the sisters and of Lucia, and whispered how patience had been their weapon. Years later, a child of the quarters, now grown, would go to the place where the medal lay buried beneath the burned earth. The field had regrown with low scrub, and the soil held its secret tightly. The person knelt and pressed fingers into the ground, and felt for a moment like an heir to a story that had been fought for in silence. They would not find legal records proving what had been done. There would be no brass plaque marking the event. The record of their labor was oral and living. It moved in song and in names passed to daughters and sons. When the sisters met for the last time by the mango tree, many seasons later, they did not make a show of triumph. Dahlia took the patois from beneath her shift and smoothed the leather with a thumb. She thought of Lucia's face, of the first time the child had been taught to sew a hem, of the nights bent over a candle copying numbers that would be used as a blade. There was exhaustion in her voice when she spoke. "We kept our promise," she said simply. The others nodded. There was no dancing. There was a kind of exhausted accord, the peace of people who had done something they believed necessary and now had to live with the result. The Baron died some years later, alone in his chair, his hands wrapped around a teacup that had once been a part of finer customs. No one in the town threw a parade. The newspapers printed a measured obituary that spoke of a man of means and temperament. The Senzala did not attend his funeral as an official body. Their mourning was private and complicated, layered with the relief that a tyrant's season was over, and with the grief that so much had been taken to make that end possible. He had humiliated the 7 daughters of the slave quarters, and he had lost the only things he ever loved: his standing, his alliances, his sense of being a man among men. The end was not a tale of righteous triumph, so much as the slow performance of consequence. The sisters had paid with years. The society around them absorbed the story into its comfortable explanations. Yet in the mouths of those who had lived it, the tale remained sharp and true. They had unmade a house of cruelty, not with sword but with patience, intelligence, and the terrible economy of memory. What survives is not the count of what was burned or the precise number of coins lost. What survives is the knowledge that a small band of women, trained in the arts the world called domestic and invisible, could realign the levers of power by playing the long game. Their victory was not simple. It left them changed, older, shorn of certain kinds of joy. They carried within them a quiet grief and a slow, stubborn satisfaction. On market days, years after the baron's decline, old women would nod to one another when the topic arose and would say the same thing. The world can be unmade by those it least expects, and justice often arrives not in thunder, but in the patient, steady opening of small doors. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you most, and share it with someone who appreciates the quiet, hard work of justice.